Gardevoir wandered along a forest path, her eyes filled with curiosity and wonder. Suddenly, she stopped in front of a shining stone beautifully embedded in the ground. Mysterious and alluring, it gleamed with a golden hue. Driven by her inquisitive nature, Gardevoir gently touched the stone with her hand. And in that moment, a power was unleashed. Instead of transforming her as she expected, a strange warmth spread through her body. At first, it was just a mild tingling, but quickly it became a pulsating energy that made her shiver. Gardevoir tried to pull away, but the power became more intense. She watched in shock as her body began to grow, not just in size, but in stature. Her legs stretched, and the trees around her seemed to shrink in comparison. Overwhelmed by a wave of panic and wonder, Gardevoir reached a height of over 50 feet. She now gazed down upon the world, which looked tiny from her unexpectedly gigantic form. As she tentatively strode out of the forest, her massive strides left imprints in the ground like small craters. People and Pokémon nearby ran in terror, some pointing and shouting, while others hid behind trees and rocks. Gardevoir's heart sank at the sight of the panic she had caused. But amidst her concern, there was also a sense of superiority, a strange and surprisingly enjoyable feeling of being so gigantic. Observing the world on this scale was an experience she had never imagined. Gardevoir could feel the magic bubbling inside her, a sense of strength and control over her destiny. She slowly began to feel more comfortable in her new size and discovered that she now had a new kind of control. Instead of running in panic, she decided to explore her new state. She began walking along a small river winding through the forest, her massive strides almost silent compared to the enormous size she now possessed. People and Pokémon who had previously fled now seemed to adapt to her presence, almost as if they were getting used to seeing her. Gardevoir started to realize that her new fate might not be as frightening as she initially thought. However, from the people's perspective, Gardevoir's sudden transformation into a giant was a source of intense fear and unease. They gazed up at her overwhelming figure, her slender yet gigantic body moving with a graceful power that was almost hypnotic. Her steps left deep imprints in the ground, and her mere presence cast shadows that seemed to engulf everything around her. People desperately shouted to her, their voices filled with panic and pleas to stop. But even as Gardevoir looked down at them, she was unable to understand their words. Her mind was filled with confusion and an urge to explore this new scale, and she continued toward the city, unaware of the damage she could cause. The nearby city came into view, and now people's fear truly escalated. They streamed away from the streets, screaming warnings and begging for help from anyone who would listen. Gardevoir's strides became more purposeful, her curiosity drawing her toward the densely populated area. But amidst this terror, there were also those who began to view her actions with a mix of wonder. What could have caused this transformation? Was she out of control or just curious? They were determined to find a way to communicate with her before the situation escalated further. Gardevoir's face lit up as she entered the city. Her gigantic body moved almost majestically between the tall buildings, her eyes sparkling with fascination and joy at the new world she was exploring. However, her innocent exploration was a terrible catastrophe for the city's residents. Her steps turned cars into metal-flattened balls and inadvertently trampled on people trying to flee. For her, this was a world of wonder, but for them, it was a terrible struggle for survival. Screams and panic filled the air as Gardevoir continued her unwitting march through the city. While some of the residents fled in terror, others gathered courage and attempted to make contact with the giant Pokémon. They shouted at her, trying to catch her attention and convey that her actions were causing great destruction. But in Gardevoir's world, everything was still an adventure, and she didn't understand the consequences her steps were having. Amidst all the chaos, there was hope to communicate with her, to reach the Pokémon that had once been friendly and caring. But time was running out, and the city was becoming a stage of devastation. For the city's inhabitants, Gardevoir's sudden giant presence was a terrible reality. They looked in shock and horror at how each of her steps was destructive, crushing, and unfathomable. Cars were pulverized under her feet, houses were crushed, and streets were torn up like paper. While some desperately fled the city, Others fought against the tide of chaos and destruction. Trained Pokemon were summoned to help. There was Blastoise, spraying water to extinguish fires, Machamp lifting heavy building debris to save people in need, and Alakazam attempting to create barriers to protect them from the unstoppable. People coordinated in a desperate attempt to evacuate as many as possible, while the Pokemon they had trained and loved fought alongside them. Together, they tried to save those still caught in Gardevoir's rage and help them escape to safety. Every second was precious as the situation only worsened with Gardevoir's continued unwitting destruction. They tried to reach her, to get her to stop, but she seemed unable to understand the catastrophe she had triggered. In this chaotic scene, the city's inhabitants, aided by their Pokemon, fought against time and the extent of destruction to save as many lives as possible. Gardevoir, unaware of the damage she had caused, suddenly felt a hunger tearing at her insides. Her gigantic figure led her to a mall, where she allowed herself to sink to her knees, gently removing the roof of the building to peer inside the stores. The astonished people inside stared at her in disbelief. Gardevoir's smile grew, and in her innocent curiosity, she began taking various food items from the shelves and eating them. To her, it was a simple act, but for them, it was sheer terror. The people in the mall panicked, grabbing their belongings and running screaming toward the exit, afraid of becoming unwitting prey to her insatiable hunger. Gardevoir didn't notice their panic and just continued eating, unaware of the terrors she was creating around her. It was a heartbreaking moment that turned everything upside down for Gardevoir. In an unfortunate move, her hunger led her to inadvertently grab a handful of people, almost as if they were a part of her meal. Their screams pierced her consciousness like a painful slap. She abruptly stopped and closed her mouth with a quiver. Eyes wide with shock, she looked down at the frightened people in her hand as time seemed to stand still. Their gazes filled with pure terror, their screams now echoing endlessly in her mind, made her realize what she had caused. Slowly, Gardevoir lowered her hand and gently let the frightened people slide back to safety on the ground. She looked around, and for the first time, she took it all in. The people running in panic, buildings in ruins, and the chaos she had caused. Her face expressed both sorrow and regret as she understood the consequences of her actions. With tears shimmering in her eyes, she looked at the city she had loved and the people she had now scared. Her heart broke with pain at causing so much fear and destruction without even realizing it. With tearful eyes and a breaking heart, Gardevoir retreated from the city. The trees of the forest embraced her, and she turned toward the place where everything began. Each step was filled with a heaviness of sorrow, as if each movement reminded her of the mistakes she had made. People from the city who had witnessed her past actions watched her go. They could see the tears shimmering in her eyes and the sense of sorrow enveloping her, realizing that she hadn't acted out of malice, but out of ignorance. A kind of compassion began to sprout in their hearts. A few from the city followed her at a respectful distance, understanding that Gardevoir had been hurt by her own ignorance more than any of them. They knew she wasn't malicious, but rather innocent and unprepared for the powers she suddenly possessed. In the tranquil surroundings of the forest, Gardevoir let her tears flow freely. She needed time to understand, reflect, and forgive herself for the harm she inadvertently caused. A vow grew within her to learn more about her new strength, to understand its limits, and to use it to help rather than harm. The people who had been scared of her now became more open to the idea of understanding her. They no longer saw her as a monster, but as a creature that needed to learn and grow. Experienced Pokemon trainers, led by some of the most knowledgeable and compassionate among them, followed the large imprints of Gardevoir's steps deep into the forest. They had heard of the events unfolding in the city, but their purpose was not to confront or defeat. Instead, they wanted to understand and help. After an intense search, they finally found Gardevoir. She cried softly, and her body trembled with sorrow and despair. The trainers approached slowly, their own Pokemon by their side, and the expression of wonder at Gardevoir's gigantic figure was evident in their eyes. Instead of fear and hostility, these trainers wanted to offer their help and understanding. They had experienced countless situations with Pokemon struggling to control their powers or adapt to new purposes. Now they faced one of the most unique and challenging situations yet. With caution and respect, they approached Gardevoir. Some of their Pokemon sent calming signals, while others stood ready to assist in some way. Their goal was to understand how Gardevoir had become a gigantic creature and what was needed to help her find her way back to balance and understanding. It was a moment marked by compassion and the desire to help a creature in need rather than defeat a threat. Gardevoir was still filled with a sense of confusion, but the trainers reassured her of their intentions to help. Her fear slowly began to diminish as they attempted to create calmness and understanding around her. The trainers who had come to help listened attentively to her story. As she pointed to the stone that had triggered her transformation, the trainers examined it closely. One of them cautiously picked up the stone, and to their surprise, nothing happened immediately. However, upon closer inspection of the stone, they realized that its surface was enveloped in a kind of mysterious aura. It wasn't clear at first glance, but the stone seemed to radiate a power that could have been transferred to Gardevoir during her touch. They understood that the stone was the source of her sudden transformation into a gigantic creature. Its power had triggered an uncontrolled growth in Gardevoir without her even being aware of it. The trainers met each other's gaze, filled with a mix of wonder and concern. How could they help Gardevoir return to her normal size? How could they ward off the power that had been transferred from the stone? The trainers examined the mysterious stone carefully and decided to bring it to the city's scientists for further investigation. However, Gardevoir couldn't stay alone. She needed food, shelter, and care. One of the trainers cautiously retrieved a Pokeball and suggested temporarily capturing Gardevoir to take care of her until they found a solution to her size-changing challenge. The other trainers were worried that owning such a powerful Pokemon might make one the most powerful trainer in the world, but they chose to trust him. The Pokeball flew toward Gardevoir, but instead of capturing her, the trainer who threw the ball was struck by its rebounding force and rendered unconscious. The other trainers were astonished by the sudden turn of events. One of the trainers took the initiative and suggested Simon, someone known for his deep understanding of Pokemon and kind heart, to take care of Gardevoir. However, it would require persuasion after the failed Pokeball attempt. Gardevoir cautiously observed the unconscious man and reached out to him, uncertain of his condition after the Pokeball incident. The trainers tried to explain that he wasn't harmed and that they would take care of him, but Gardevoir showed care and gently lifted him. It was hard for the trainers not to smile at her heartfelt gesture. They asked if it was acceptable for her to accompany them to Simon's house. Gardevoir looked at them and quietly accepted their invitation. Together, they headed back to the city, where Gardevoir, from her gigantic perspective, observed the people working hard to clean up after the destruction. Her eyes welled up with tears once again. One of the trainers noticed her sorrow and asked one of their Pokemon to fly up to her. With Charizard's help, the trainer ascended to Gardevoir's side and reassured her that they were there to help her return to her normal size. Touched by their kindness, Gardevoir smiled gratefully, ready to embrace the trainer as a thank you, but was quickly cautioned to stop. She immediately halted and looked nervously at the trainer. The unexpected reaction made her realize how large and powerful she was compared to them. Her desire to show gratitude was overshadowed by the fear of causing harm. Approaching Simon's house, Gardevoir cautiously walked alongside the trainer through the forest paths. Suddenly, she heard a buzzing sound, as if joy filled the air. They followed the sound and arrived at a gigantic glass cabin where a cheerful cavalcade of Pokemon played and explored. A group of Eevee happily ran around playing hide-and-seek, while a bunch of Pikachu engaged in a game, trying to balance on a large ball. A team of Bulbasaur worked together to tend a small garden, while a Chansey helped nurse and comfort some smaller Pokemon who had gotten scratches during play. Activity was everywhere, and the sweet sound of Pokemon playing and communicating filled the air. Gardevoir smiled warmly as she witnessed the joy these Pokemon shared, brightening her eyes. Suddenly, the trainer noticed Simon approaching them. Simon, an experienced Pokemon trainer and researcher, naturally drawn to Pokemon with a heart filled with understanding and love for them. Simon politely greeted and lightly bowed as a gesture of respect, gazing up at the enormous Gardevoir. He curiously inquired about how Gardevoir had become so large. The trainer explained about the unknown stone and their assumption of its role in her transformation, after which they had sent the stone to the city's scientists for further examination. After listening attentively, Simon turned his gaze back to Gardevoir and then to the trainer. He asked if they wished for him to take care of her until she returned to her normal size. The trainer, somewhat expectant, spoke of the many positive rumors they had heard about Simon and his relationship with Pokemon. But before the trainer could continue, Simon kindly interrupted. "It's fine. I'll take care of her," said Simon, bringing relief and confidence to the trainer. Simon assured Gardevoir that they would find a place for her and ensure she got food as she looked hungry. Gardevoir smiled gratefully and willingly followed Simon. Together, they walked towards Simon's house, and Gardevoir felt secure knowing she had a caring person like Simon by her side. Simon led Gardevoir to a secluded area in his Pokemon garden. As they moved through the garden, they noticed Pokemon and staff looking up, surprised by the sight of the gigantic Gardevoir walking alongside Simon. Simon kept an eye on Gardevoir as they reached a spacious area filled with flowers and trees, a place that would be comfortable for Gardevoir to stay temporarily. He saw Gardevoir begin to settle down and noted her fatigue after the long day. Immediately, he pulled out his phone and made calls to arrange food and water for her. Gardevoir smiled gratefully at Simon, who reassured her that a truck would arrive with supplies. He also offered that if she needed anything, she could ask his staff. He hoped she would enjoy her time there with them. Feeling happy and thankful, Gardevoir wished to embrace Simon as a gesture of gratitude. However, she stopped herself, remembering her size could pose a danger. Simon noticed her movement and walked towards her with open arms and a smile, inviting her for a hug. Gardevoir's eyes lit up with surprise and joy as she gently lifted the small man, embracing him warmly against her face. Simon felt Gardevoir's pulsating warmth and care, an emotion he had never experienced before. It was like a wave of warmth and kindness flowing through him. Gardevoir stopped and gently set him down, beginning to settle in. With a smile on his face, Simon returned to his house, filled with an incredible sense of warmth and gratitude. Gardevoir stayed at her temporary home, enjoying the new place and the caring people around her. 2 large trucks arrived at Simon's Pokemon garden, filled with food and water for the gigantic Gardevoir. The men jumping out of the trucks were surprised by the sight of the gigantic Pokemon. They politely greeted her and began unloading the food. Curious and eager to see how they worked, Gardevoir approached cautiously to observe their work. One of the men used his Pokemon, Machoke, to lift fruits and food from the truck. Gardevoir was fascinated by Machoke's strength and accuracy in handling the unloading. Once the work was finished, Gardevoir started to take the food in her hands and began to eat. She enjoyed the taste of the fruits and felt grateful for the generosity shown to her by these people. Her smile of joy and satisfaction was evident as she ate. After seeing her enjoy the food, the men returned to their trucks and continued their journey. They were impressed by her friendly nature and how much she appreciated the food they had brought. Gardevoir, on her part, was grateful for their generosity and showed it by relishing every piece of the food they had delivered. While Gardevoir continued eating, some small Bulbasaur started appearing to share her food. Gardevoir looked down at them as they ate a bit of her portion. Suddenly, she heard a female voice warning the Bulbasaurs, saying, "Hey, you little guys, don't eat her food. You have your own." Gardevoir looked in the direction of the voice and saw a young woman with long blonde hair approaching. "Hello," the woman said kindly to Gardevoir. "My name is Sophie, and I am Simon's wife." Gardevoir observed her curiously, and Sophie continued with a smile. "I hope you're doing well here. You've had a long day. You're welcome to wander around our garden, but please be careful where you step so you don't accidentally tread on anyone." Gardevoir listened attentively to Sophie and nodded in understanding. Sophie headed towards the house where Simon was, and Gardevoir yawned, lying down to rest and sleep. The calm atmosphere and Sophie's kind words gave Gardevoir a sense of peace and security. She was grateful for the warm welcome and was determined to respect the garden and the people around her. Gardevoir woke up from her rest and rose gently. She began to walk around the garden, eager to explore the new area. With every step, she was mindful of her size and carefully passed by flowers and small pathways. Along the way, she encountered more of Simon's small Pokémon and the staff taking care of the garden. A group of Smeargle painted colorful patterns on the stones, while a couple of Jigglypuff sang sweet melodies to soothe other Pokémon. Gardevoir noticed a group of tiny Pichu playing tag on a lawn, creating a lively atmosphere. As she continued her journey through the garden, Gardevoir observed how the staff worked alongside the Pokémon to maintain the garden and create a beautiful and peaceful atmosphere. She was impressed by how the small Pokémon and the staff collaborated harmoniously, creating a fantastic oasis of natural beauty. Gardevoir stopped and observed a Charmander playing with a ball. The Charmander noticed Gardevoir's presence and ran towards her with a curious glint in its eyes. The little Pokémon tried to communicate, proudly showing her its favorite toy. This interaction made Gardevoir smile warmly. Even though she was much larger than the other Pokémon, she was still a part of this world. Her understanding that her size wasn't a hindrance, but rather a strength, filled her with a sense of obligation to respect and support this micro-world. The day continued, with Gardevoir's exploratory journey through the garden, where more Pokémon encountered her during her wanderings. A group of Pikachu gathered around her, starting to dance and play around her feet. There were also a flock of Ralts, fascinated by her majestic appearance, curiously exploring her surroundings. While Gardevoir interacted with the Pokémon, the staff and Simon and Sophie watched from a distance. They were thrilled and pleased to see how Gardevoir was accepted by the garden and its inhabitants. Simon and Sophie exchanged smiles and warm glances, delighted at how Gardevoir was integrating so well into their small world. The staff continued to take care of the garden and assist the Pokémon in their activities. Some of them kept an eye on Gardevoir, but they viewed her with positive curiosity and joy as they observed how she interacted with the small Pokémon. Simon and Sophie were excited to see Gardevoir's acceptance and integration into their garden. Their smiles grew wider, and their hearts were filled with gratitude and joy at how everything was developing so positively. The next day, Simon came down to speak with Gardevoir. He explained gently that there were some tasks in the garden she might be able to help with, and the money she earned could support the garden and pay wages to his staff. However, he emphasized that he didn't want to pressure her into anything and that it was only if she wished. Gardevoir looked at him with reflective eyes. She pondered over the warm welcome she had received and how welcome she felt. The desire to contribute and give something back grew within her, and with a smile and a nod, she accepted to help. Simon's face lit up with joy at her willingness to assist. Simon showed her areas where she could perform tasks that suited her colossal size. The people around her were friendly and welcoming, embracing her with open arms. Gardevoir began to perform the tasks assigned to her with care and precision. She used her strength and size to handle the tasks in a way that benefited the garden and its inhabitants. The people around her appreciated her help and efforts, and she felt more integrated and useful than ever before. Over the next few days, Gardevoir engaged in various tasks outside the garden. She was approached by different companies and private individuals who had heard about her abilities and strength and needed her help. She spent time with a company that had trouble moving heavy objects, and with her impressive strength, she was able to lift and move large things that were impossible for others to handle. Her precise movements and careful handling made her extremely useful. Later, she worked with a private individual who needed help rearranging their garden. Gardevoir used her sense of beauty and precision to create a beautiful and harmonious layout of the garden. Her enormous size was an advantage as she moved large stones and trees with ease. During these working days, Gardevoir made friends with the people around her. She was accommodating and impressed them with her kindness and ability to perform tasks in an exceptional manner. At the same time, she enjoyed the company of the Pokémon that also assisted in the work. Her understanding of various Pokémon and their collaboration inspired her and others around her. During this time, Gardevoir experienced a sense of satisfaction in helping others. She felt useful and appreciated, and her confidence grew as she interacted with different people and Pokémon outside the garden. While Gardevoir continued with her tasks outside the garden, an unexpected event occurred at a nearby laboratory. Within the laboratory's safe walls, the staff was engaged in studying the mysterious stone that had previously transformed Gardevoir into a giantess. This day was different. The stone, which they had carefully studied and experimented with, suddenly began emitting an intense beam of light that filled the entire room. One of the researchers, Alma, was drawn towards the stone by an almost magnetic force, as if the stone was calling out to her. Alma, one of the laboratory's researchers, was drawn to the radiant stone and approached it cautiously to examine it further. A wondrous power pulsed from the stone and flowed through her body as she touched it. A warm, tingling sensation spread through her limbs, and suddenly she began to grow. It started slowly at first, like a gentle wave of change gradually taking over her physique. Alma stood in amazement, trying to understand the force overtaking her. Her clothes tore and stretched as her body grew larger and larger. Panic rose among the others in the laboratory as they watched her grow. Tools and equipment fell to the ground as they tried to flee. Alma's hands reached the ceiling, and she could feel her shoulders pressing against the walls. The researchers shouted and ran to get away from what now seemed to be an unbearable threat. Alma felt trapped. Her head hit the ceiling, and she could feel the building's structures bending and giving way to her growing size. It sounded like a deafening roar as her body broke through the building's wall. Fragments of bricks flew into the air, and the people outside shouted in fear as they saw Alma step out of the laboratory as a giantess. She looked confused and disoriented, as if she was unaware of what had happened to her and where she had ended up. Her body stood outside the ruined building, and the people in the area were shocked by the sight of a new giantess coming into the world. As she stared bewildered at her own gigantic being, she slowly began to move and rise from the destroyed remnants of the laboratory. After a long and rewarding day of work, Gardevoir returned to the garden, where she was greeted by a warm and welcoming atmosphere. The peaceful spot in the middle of the garden beckoned her, and she joined the other Pokémon in forming a circle of calm and harmony. Together with her small Pokémon friends, Gardevoir shared moments of understanding and friendship. As a Grisadilla flower unfolded, Petalil danced around it, adding to the tranquility. Pikachu and Eevee played happily in the tall grass, their joy bringing a smile to Gardevoir's face. But amidst the serenity, the sound of running footsteps shattered the peace. Simon, the owner of the seas, came rushing towards Gardevoir in a state of panic. Gasping for breath, he explained that an accident had occurred in the laboratory. Something had gone terribly wrong during their work with the stone, causing a researcher named Alma to transform into a destructive giantess. Simon pleaded with Gardevoir for help, acknowledging that she was the only one who could avert the impending disaster. Worried, Gardevoir pondered the situation, mindful of her own unpredictable transformation. She didn't want to harm anyone, yet felt a deep responsibility to save the city and its people. Understanding Gardevoir's concerns, Simon assured her they didn't expect her to fight, but rather to use her calming presence to help subdue Alma and stop the destruction. Gardevoir weighed her options, fearful of the unknown, yet resolute in her determination. With a firm resolve, she rose to her feet and followed Simon towards the laboratory, ready to confront the unpredictable power of the mysterious stone. Gardevoir and Simon hurried into town, where a worried Sophie anxiously awaited their arrival. As Simon rushed towards her, Sophie's relief was palpable, and she embraced him with tears streaming down her face. She expressed her confusion and disbelief at Alma's sudden descent into madness, as Alma had always been kind and gentle. Simon comforted Sophie, suggesting that the stone responsible for Alma's transformation was likely the cause of the chaos. Standing stoically by Simon's side, Gardevoir observed the emotional exchange. Sophie looked up at the towering Pokemon, her tear-filled eyes pleading for Gardevoir to handle the situation without causing harm to Alma. Gardevoir met Sophie's gaze, conveying a sense of understanding and reassurance through her calm expression. Together, the trio made their way towards the city, only to be confronted with a scene of utter chaos. The streets were filled with panicked individuals, Pokemon trainers desperately attempting to restore order amidst the destruction. Buildings lay in ruins, and Alma, in her colossal form, wreaked havoc upon the city. Assessing the gravity of the situation, Gardevoir prepared herself for what lay ahead. Simon stood in Gardevoir's hand, calling out to Alma in an attempt to capture her attention. He conveyed their intentions to help and restore peace, hoping to calm her destructive rampage. However, Alma, lost within her own maelstrom of chaos, glanced down at them, her eyes vacant and unresponsive to their words. Enveloped by anger and unpredictability, Alma charged relentlessly towards Gardevoir, forcefully slamming her into a nearby building. Determined to shield Simon from harm, Gardevoir clutched him tightly, bracing herself against Alma's furious assault. Now locked in a battle of giants, Gardevoir and Alma clashed fiercely. Though overwhelmed by Alma's overwhelming rage, Gardevoir fought valiantly, desperately clinging on to Simon while defending herself. Alma, consumed by uncontrolled anger, launched powerful punches and kicks at Gardevoir, the force of each blow shaking the very foundations of the city. Cars were trampled under their massive feet, and small houses crumbled beneath the weight of the struggling giants. The once vibrant city had transformed into a battlefield where two uncontrollable forces clashed. Trainers and their Pokemon watched helplessly as the confrontation unfolded. Gardevoir, mindful of avoiding unnecessary harm to Alma, skillfully evaded her attacks while shielding Simon from danger. However, Alma, lost in a different reality, seemed impervious to reason or persuasion. Amidst the chaos, as buildings disintegrated like toys and a cloud of dust filled the air, Gardevoir carefully laid Simon down on the ground. Her focus shifted back to Alma, and the battle between the colossal Pokemon continued, neither gaining the upper hand. Trainers and their Pokemon struggled to find a solution, but it was evident that this clash between two unpredictable forces would not be easily resolved. As the intense battle raged on, Gardevoir and Alma stomped through the city, leaving destruction in their wake. Unfortunately, they unwittingly approached the humans still caught in the midst of the chaos. Cars were crushed and buildings collapsed, intensifying the already catastrophic situation. Nevertheless, Gardevoir, even amidst the fierce battle, maintained her clarity and determination. Recognizing the imminent danger to the people, she swiftly took action. With a graceful movement, Gardevoir leaned down and gently lifted cars and people from the streets, carrying them to safety. Utilizing her giant hand as a protective barrier, she shielded the humans from harm. Despite the ongoing clash with Alma, Gardevoir's unwavering resolve ensured the rescue of those in peril. Simon, astonished by Gardevoir's compassionate rescue efforts amidst the chaos, realized the gentle giant's unwavering desire to protect humans. In the midst of the destruction, a thought sparked in Simon's mind. The stone that had transformed both Gardevoir and Alma could potentially hold the key to returning Alma to her normal state. Overwhelmed by shock and burdened with a sense of responsibility, Simon felt compelled to take action. He knew that seeking the stone and finding a solution would require courage and involve risks, but he couldn't ignore the possibility of ending this nightmare. Meanwhile, Gardevoir continued her relentless battle with Alma, steadfastly shielding the people she had rescued from the devastating clash of the two giants. Amidst the chaos, Simon and Sophie stood together, watching the fierce confrontation with deep concern. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind them. They turned to see one of the scientists approaching, holding the mysterious stone that had unleashed this turmoil upon them. Simon's confusion was quickly dispelled as the scientist explained that there might be a chance to restore Alma to her normal self using the stone. Simon and Sophie exchanged astonished glances, realizing the slim but hopeful possibility of ending the destruction and saving the city. Though uncertain about the full extent of the stone's powers and wary of potential risks, the scientist recognized the urgency of the situation. Together, They agreed that they had to try everything within their power to halt the chaos unleashed by Gardevoir and Alma. Their collective gaze shifted towards the city, where the colossal battle between the two Pokémon raged on. Simon, Sophie, and the scientist resolved to seize the stone and harness its power in an attempt to restore peace to Alma and bring an end to the devastating rampage. With determination in their hearts, they embarked on a journey towards the heart of the battle zone, knowing that the stone held their last hope amidst the swirling chaos. Simon, Sophie, and the researcher entered the battle zone, witnessing the intense confrontation between Gardevoir and Alma. Gardevoir fought with all her might, but it was clear that she couldn't overpower the raging Giantess alone. As Simon watched Gardevoir being overpowered and thrown to the ground, he felt a sense of powerlessness. However, when Gardevoir smiled at him despite the pain, hope ignited in his heart. He rushed to her side and explained that the stone they possessed could potentially return Alma to her normal state. Gardevoir carefully took the small stone from Simon, standing up with determination to end the destruction. Alma, seeing Gardevoir rise again, charged towards her with furious force. But in a surprising turn of events, the stone emitted a bright light and a beam struck Alma. All onlookers, including Simon, Sophie, and the researcher, erupted in cheers as it seemed the stone had finally had a positive effect. Alma suddenly shrunk, indicating that the stone had indeed restored her to normal. However, their joy was short-lived when something unexpected occurred. The stone shone once more, this time brighter than ever. A powerful beam of energy shot out and struck Gardevoir. Shocked, everyone watched as Gardevoir began to grow slowly. Her body expanded, revealing that the stone had not only returned Alma to normal, but was now transferring her power to Gardevoir. Simon stood frozen, realizing that the stone had taken Alma's powers and bestowed them upon Gardevoir. Gardevoir transformed into an even greater Giantess, radiating an aura of immense power and energy. Overwhelmed by this unexpected development, Gardevoir felt the surge of power coursing through her, making her an even more formidable Giantess. Panic seized her as she gazed down upon the small figures of people who now appeared even tinier compared to her enormous form. In search of refuge, her eyes darted towards the forest. Without hesitation, she began moving in that direction, every step causing her to grow larger. People could only watch in awe as Gardevoir's immense figure loomed above them. Simon and Sophie, determined to stop her, struggled to keep pace as the ground trembled beneath Gardevoir's colossal steps. Desperate to halt her before she became uncontrollable, they raced after her. Meanwhile, those below scrambled to escape the colossal Pokémon, who continued to grow with each passing moment. Gardevoir, overcome with despair, saw the forest as her only possible sanctuary. She pressed onward, her size increasing with each stride. Simon and Sophie understood the urgency of stopping her before she grew too immense to handle. When they reached the forest, they could feel the ground shaking under Gardevoir's huge feet. Pokémon that lived in the forest ran away in fright from her gigantic steps. Gardevoir stopped and leaned over the forest, still crying as her body grew to the forest's borders. In the depths of the forest, there were small Pokémon that felt the earth shake. They ran away from Gardevoir's giant feet and hid in the bushes. Gardevoir could feel their fear and understood that she could no longer be close to the small Pokémon. With tears in her eyes, she stood up and retreated from the forest. Gardevoir's body was growing out of control, and her heart was filled with pain and despair. Darkness took over her mind, and she wept as she felt trapped in her own unfortunate fate. The thought of losing her new friends, Simon and Sophie, and the other Pokémon in the garden made the tears flow even more. Simon and Sophie found themselves beneath Gardevoir's massive body, which was now a shadow over them. They looked up at her like little ants, unable to fathom how big she had grown. The thoughts of what they could do swirled in their heads like a myriad of uncertainty. "Hello, Gardevoir. I could feel a violent force, so I came to see what happened. Calm down, my love. I'll fix you up and grab the stone that caused all this chaos." The creature continued, raising its hand. A force flowed from his hand and enveloped Gardevoir. The others could only stand and watch with open mouths as Gardevoir began to get smaller and smaller until she was finally back to her normal size. Simon and Sophie ran over to her and hugged her warmly. Gardevoir was filled with joy to be back to normal and surrounded by her friends. The unknown figure looked at them with a smile and walked forward. After returning the chaos to calm and saving Gardevoir, Simon and Sophie stood looking at the unknown Pokémon that had brought the light back into their lives. Simon carefully asked who he was, and the creature replied with a smile. "I'm an unknown Pokémon from an unknown world," he said calmly. Simon looked puzzled, but the question of Stone 1 brought them back to reality. The creature floated up to the stone and explained that it was created in their world. "I can't say who created the stone, but I promise that if something like this happens again, I will come and help," the creature assured. He moved to Gardevoir and listened to her wishes to be able to control his size to help them better. The creature expressed that he could do no more right now and that he had to go. He slowly disappeared from their line of sight, but not before giving one last smile. Gardevoir, Simon, and Sophie stood back, filled with gratitude and wonder at the unknown being that had entered their lives. Simon and Sophie returned to town, only to be greeted by a sight they never expected. The city, which a short time ago had been destroyed by Gardevoir's unexpected transformation, was now rebuilt and flourishing again. Bewildered trainers stood looking at the miracle that had taken place. Simon and Sophie ran over to some trainers and asked how it was possible. The trainers explained that an unknown Pokémon had used its power to rebuild the city. Simon and Sophie looked at each other in surprise, overwhelmed with gratitude and wonder at the help they had received. One of the trainers looked at Gardevoir, now back to its normal size and radiating a newfound power. "Wow, and she's back to normal? That's great," offered the trainer. Gardevoir smiled at them and thanked them for their help. Simon, Sophie, and Gardevoir returned to Simon's large garden, where Gardevoir found a quiet spot to sleep. But before falling asleep, she looked around and concentrated. A warm feeling spread through her body, and she began to grow again, this time controlled and with a new power. Gardevoir's body now reached an impressive height of 30 feet. She felt the powerful energy flow through her and smiled contentedly. Gardevoir had now learned to control her size and power, and she relished the opportunity to use them to help people and Pokémon in need. With the city rebuilt, Gardevoir back to normal, and a newfound control over her abilities, this moment marked the beginning of a new journey for Gardevoir, Simon, Sophie, and all their friends. What awaits them in the future, and what adventures will they face together? A new beginning, filled with hope and opportunity, awaited.